Yeah, tell us, Diana. How did James Dobson affect your life in very personal ways?
Well, I don't have an ex-evangelical story in the sense that I grew up with James Dobson. One thing, I was too old to grow up with James Dobson because he was just becoming really popular when I was going off to college, and plus my parents would have none of that kind of stuff. They were Benjamin Spock people through and through. Um, so
See what
um,
happened.
you see what happens. I mean, honestly, maybe that's not a good evidence for the case. But so anyway, so I didn't have that kind of experience. But as I was going through graduate school and wound up in my first years teaching, I was in a really interesting place where I was struggling a lot with what it meant to be an evangelical. And I was working at an evangelical college, and all of a sudden, all of the students that I had who were like 12 years younger than me, that was that first generation of students. So I was like 32 and they were all 20. And so they would have been first generation James Dobson kids, and they were. And boy, they had stories, and they were always talking about him. And that was the first place where I ever really heard of him, were these stories from my students. So I started paying attention to what he said, and I was immediately horrified by all the stuff that I was seeing about his vision of a Christian America. And I was also really upset about the anti-feminist piece. And so I just, that's what I was tracking. And a couple years later, I was not teaching at that college anymore for various and sundry reasons, but I was working instead as a newspaper columnist for the Santa Barbara News Press. And my column was being carried by the New York Times wire service because the news press was owned by the New York Times. And I was writing on Promise Keepers, and I was writing about the development of the early religious right. And I was writing about, all these different figures that are now part of history, but then were contemporaneous sorts of news stories. And in 1995, I wrote a piece that I loved. I remember loving it, about the UN Conference on Women, where it was a really interesting meeting. Some of it had been televised. I read about all of it that was available in print. And Hillary Clinton gave one of her most dynamic pro-feminist, pro-women, pro-children speeches ever in her career at that conference. And it was deeply embedded in faith, spirituality, and theology. And she specifically talked about that, the importance of religious belief to the women of the world. And when I heard that speech, I just went, wow, that it was the first time I really heard somebody that famous speaking the language that was my heart. And so I wrote a column about it. It appeared in the Santa Barbara News Press, and that column went insane. It was the closest thing to viral column that I had in those years, and it got published everywhere, and, um, and including the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post. I mean, it was all over the place. About a month later, I get a telephone call from a friend of mine who actually worked in Washington, D.C. This is a whole different day and age. He worked at the Heritage Foundation, of all things. And he said, did you see it? And I said, did I see what? He said, James Dobson attacked your column on the front page of the Focus on the Family newsletter, and he called you and Hillary Clinton radical anti-biblical feminists. And I was so excited. It was like my own farewell Rob Bell moment, It was goodbye DBD, a DBB. You're no longer an evangelical to me. And so anyway, but that was the beginning of a truly terrible month, because that newsletter, as Robby said, went out to millions of people, and my mail started coming in, and all these letters from old friends. Oh, have you lost your faith? Why are you attacking that nice man who gives parenting advice on the radio? Where's your head? I'm praying for you, sister. I was getting horrible phone calls, and that was incident that kicked off the most ever death threats that I've gotten in my public life.
Ooh.
It was by
Wow.
James Dobson attacking me personally on the front page of the Focus on the Family newsletter. And it was it was kind of exciting, but it was really also very scary.
Thank you for your ministry and writing. I mean,
You're welcome.
because I can imagine that the way you felt hearing Hillary Clinton speak those words, when people read your words, especially women, they felt similarly. And so there was this onslaught of very vocal detractors, but I do suspect one day in heaven you'll hear from the women who were so empowered by what you said and what you continue to say. But I'm sorry you had to go through that, and thank you for sharing.
Well, it's one of those things where you become part of the story you're writing about. And
Mm,
I think we all have experienced that in some form. You say what you have to say and you do the analysis you have to do and you write something that's beautiful and crisp and compelling and people respond. And that's the good folks that you're talking about, Jamar, and also the ones who want you to be silent. And it was for me, a lot of people said this means you keep going, you know,
mm.
never give up. Just don't give up. So I think that we all share that kind of experience with the different things that we write about. I know that of the four of you. It's, I think, one of the reasons we're all friends.
I'll just say this on the tail end of this topic: the use of mass media to spread these messages cannot be overestimated. And what frustrates me so is that the people who have a much better theology, much healthier outlooks, are so behind on it. Which is not entirely, the fault of an individual or something. A lot of money went into Focus on the Family, which is partly why they could spread so far and wide. But, the technology of the day, from radio to videotapes to cassette tapes to mailing lists and on and on and on, is part of what helped this thing go, I would say, honestly, global, to the extent that U.S. Christianity affects religion around the world. And now we live in a digital age where the message can spread even further and faster, but also the barrier to entry is lower. You don't need millions of dollars to acquire a mailing list. You can start a Substack
Yeah,
or
four
an
random people can
Instagram
just
page.
start on Zoom, right?
A random conversation that we start on Zoom, right? And so that's just my encouragement for us. The Bible says to be wise as serpents, innocent as doves, to be savvy about communication today, because not just because it's like the thing people are doing, but because misinformation, toxic theology, all of this bad stuff is out there. And to the extent that we don't use the same tools, different message, but the same tools, then we allow that stuff to just be out there, go unchallenged, and potentially continue to ruin lives.